bringing people together from around the world is all about how we learn, and certainly how the examples you show can help inform what we do here locally. I'd like to start with this question of time, and in particular, the sometimes difficult connection between electoral cycles and larger programs. Can you just unpack a little bit first, Lykke? What are the ways in which you can you approach a political scenario where someone is essentially going to be out of pocket, or somehow or other resources are going to be consumed, the outputs from which, the benefits from which some other politician is going to be cutting the ribbon on? What are the ways in which you can try and mitigate that tension between timescales?
Well, I think there are two ways. The first one is, of course, making sure that there's also something in it for the politicians here and now. And for instance, the squares that we have already finished, I mean, the current politicians, they have been able to go out, cut the ribbon. They've been able to go to the election saying this is something that we have done. Mm-hmm. But again, I think it's also, and I've been really positively surprised by the Copenhagen politicians about that they feel sort of the fact that they are acting on time, mm-hmm. Sort of due diligence. I think that has also been very important for them to say that they can see the need to do something. I think we have managed to explain to them why we cannot do something here, something there, and so on. They have understood the importance of having some of this connected system, mm-hmm. In order to have a solution that will work also in the future. Mm-hmm.
Toby, in that kind of context or in time, is there examples or things you can think of that would represent what you might call quick wins, some ways of getting people on board who might be skeptical and they don't want to be talking about 10 and 20 years' time, but what can we do that I can cut a ribbon on in 3 years' time?
Yeah, sure. So let me just say, I think that the question is a good one in terms of electoral cycles and so forth. I think it's worth bearing in mind that Australia is at a point in its history where we have particularly corrosive politics that really, and you've just seen now with the election of a Liberal Premier in South Australia, and a quick pivot straight away to, mm-hmm. this will mean a change to energy policy and so forth, where so it is particularly stark in an Australian context. I'd also say that in terms, I do have an answer to your specific question, but I should provide the caveat in terms of my work, that we've yet to see what happens at the next election, and mm-hmm. Whether or not that has an impact in terms of some of our longer term plans. One of the reasons I was talking about the urban forest, and to your point about quick wins, and the nature of a forest is there's no particularly quick win, but it is about identifying things that are desirable. And this is about, we've been able to position it as improving amenity, and providing spaces that people want to live in, and again that point about it's not, although we actually do want to raise a lot of money to make it happen faster, in other ways you can say this is not about asking for more money, this is just about using our existing resources better. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there, I think desirability, affordability, and practicality are probably the three things that are pretty fundamental to quick wins. Mm.
I mean, it is a real significant concern here, because what Toby is alluding to is situations where we have a change of government, all of a sudden $1 billion worth of road or a rail or whatever suddenly gets wiped out. So it's when I see big plans, that's always the alarm bell is, how do you manage that? I wonder whether one response to that goes back, Toby, to your context of not being one single metropolitan authority, but actually, is there some strength in scale where you're dealing with 32 smaller LGAs?
On a good day. One of the sort of the a lot of resilience thinking has come from biology and ecological studies, and it is the nature of a resilient system that it is diverse. And so there is an argument to be said that actually by being able to work with a large group of councils that are themselves inherently political and not always long term, but you can, we've definitely had councils that have been not terribly supportive, but then switched to being more supportive. And I guess what we hope is that we manage to, as we really start to get deeper into implementation, have enough of a groundswell that actually it carries those that are less supportive at times. The other thing I'd say, just quickly, I don't want to go on too long about this, but you've always also got to be careful what you wish for. So, it would seem initially sort of attractive, if we could just have one large government for metropolitan Melbourne, that would make it so much easier. But I think on a day-to-day basis, the connection that our 32 local government areas, or 79 across the state, have with their immediate communities are really enhanced by their being that little bit smaller and that bit more able to really focus on immediate needs.
And in the case of Copenhagen, you showed some examples, I guess, in central kind of Copenhagen. Do you have reciprocal relationships with neighbouring regions, etc.?
We do. I mean, one of the biggest we have a project about a creek, or it's not a river, but it's a small creek that actually goes all all the way from it starts further up and then passes through 9 different municipalities, including Copenhagen. And there we've done sort of a joint project about actually solving the flooding issues from that small stream. By also, I mean, Copenhagen is investing money upstream, for instance, in some of the other municipalities, because we can see that the solution to a problem is not at our doorstep, but it's actually further upstream. And so it is possible. And I think that climate change in general will force municipalities and so on to work across administrative boundaries.
I might just quickly both build from Lykke's point and also go back to your previous question. So Adrian Gray from Brimbank is going to talk, I think, a bit later about some of the great work being done by Greening the West, an initiative across 7 Western councils and a water retailer and a whole bunch of entities that is a great example of what Lykke's talking about in terms of that collaboration and the need for it. At the same time, so is this sort of diversity and a lack of control great? I could also point to another example where one council put up a motion that they would pay to put in storm water capture underneath the upstream in a basically under a golf course. It was going to be a great bit of urban design put underneath the golf course, and the other council voted it down, even though it was going to be paid for by their neighbours, because they said that wasn't within their jurisdiction. So for every positive, there's a challenge with...
Indeed, and I believe Nigel may give some examples later on about precisely that upstream, downstream tensions. Of course, you can't really talk about long-term projections in a city without also talking about population growth and densities. Was that somehow part of your calculations in Copenhagen, understanding where population densities were going and what that would mean for amenity in the street, etc.?
Definitely. I mean, it is, because of course it puts a limit to the amount of public space that we can actually look at and use, because it's going to be used for something else. It's about discussing with developers in being able to actually have cloudburst structures on their land and so on. So there's a lot in that, and it's also in it because our even though it's a sort of a new infrastructure, there's still a connection with the sewer system. So if you're putting in more people in a city, you're also affecting the sewer system. I mean, there's going to be a lot more going into it. And our wastewater treatment plants, there now, as their capacity is used to the max. And actually taking out stormwater we are seeing it as a way of also reducing the need for building extra capacity on the wastewater treatment plants, because we are seeing the whole thing as a sort of an integrated system.
One of the, you might say, we have an expression, the elephant in the room. One of the elephant in the rooms often tends to be around cities is business and money, where money factors into a decision-making situation. I think maybe Australia might be a little bit more enthralled to kind of neoliberal economic paradigms than Denmark. But nevertheless, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what the interactions are between. You talked quite a bit about the community and the public and about the politicians. Did you have to bring the business community along with you, and if you did, how?
Only to a limited extent. I mean, since all of ours is going to be either financed by public taxpayers' money or utility money, it's not really been an issue. It's only been an issue where we've had to discuss with, like I said, developers, and then we've had some situations also where some people, especially in the neighborhood where we have got all the embassies, couldn't understand that they weren't first in line because, of course, they were more important than other parts of the city and things like that.
Right.
But apart from that,
Yes.
I don't think it's in that way. It's been an issue. The only business that we have really tried to involve has been insurance industries, both for sharing data. We have been sharing our data, and they have been sharing their data for, I mean, all the damage claims that came after the cloudbursts, and also working with them on when it comes to sort of creating incentives for private homeowners to do something about their own building so that it's better protected. So
Right. Toby, I'm aware that your journey into this career passed through economics. You studied at London School of Economics, I believe. What's your take on how important it is to bring the business community and a kind of economic rationale to what you do?
So, I mean, I think the question that you asked, so if you link the question you asked Lykke in terms of sort of the basically corporate interests and how that can skew a city, and then also how important is it to include them. I mean, they're quite important things. So, and I think important to put together. One of the things to bear in mind, particularly when you talk about the corporate sector, i.e. large businesses rather than sort of just the private sector generally, is just as within a family or anything where you bring together quite a large number of people, what one part of it does is not necessarily consistent with what another part of it does. So you can have some really forward-looking, speaking hypothetically perhaps, very forward-looking property companies that are doing some really great things in some places and yet profoundly undermining a whole range of livability and other factors. You have to, if we're going to get to a world which is a more just and frankly less disastrous prone one, you have to have the corporate sector with you. Two final points on that. One is that, again, we kind of talk about them as corporations, like they're sort of large, well, and they are large entities, but they also are made up of people who are the citizens and potential activists. So I think how you tap into that is part of the solution, so really reaching people at that level. And we're also, as sort of the title of Design for Uncertain Times. I actually think that while times are uncertain, we also exist in sort of perverse times, by which I mean, on the one hand, yes, the corporate sector is really driving a lot of the damage and challenges that we have. They're also, just as cities are, really responding to politicians and others who are less forward-looking, and actually they are often taking action in spite of policy and other things to really try to achieve a better future. So it's a complicated
yes,
picture.
Indeed. I mean, you're both obviously very familiar with all of the background to the 100 Cities, the Resilient Cities program, and I'm curious to know, what is your take? I mean, $100 million is quite a significant investment by the Rockefeller Foundation. What is their motivation? Is it pure philanthropy or something beyond that?
Well, there are one or two of your panel or speakers coming later who have either a deeper or more nuanced or just a more caustic view. My view is that fundamentally it's come from an organization that has a long history of seeding ideas, and that they were, from all my interactions, were authentic in their view of trying to achieve that or answer that question of what would be their single greatest contribution to humanity. Again, depending where the conversation goes later on, one of the things that was pointed out to me last night was, but look at what they do to open up markets for large corporates and so forth. If you go back to the previous question, I would argue that's kind of part of the answer, but that's one for debate.
Well, basically, I think $100 million is a drop in the ocean, because, I mean, it is only, as you say, seed money. It's money that can help start a process in actually a very small number of cities. We need much more in the future, and I mean, especially I come from just 2 weeks ago. I was in Canada for the Cities IPCC conference on cities and climate change, and if you're looking at third world cities, we are talking about problems that make the problems that you have here and that we've got in Copenhagen look like, well, a walk in the park.
Yes.
So basically, we need a lot of collaboration between cities. We need a lot of money invested in research and projects on the ground to say, how can we move this forward? So, and maybe my views on the Rockefeller Foundation is also biased by the fact that they didn't want to have Copenhagen as part of them.
Go on then, Lykke.
But I think in general, I think a lot of the problems with money like this, we've also got a huge foundation in Denmark called Resilient, which is one of the large funders of C40, the organization for cities. Melbourne's also a member there. And the problem is that they also want to somehow control what's happening, which I think sometimes can be a problem, because you have to also develop some of the solutions yourself. They might have a sort of a framework, because the Rockefeller Foundation has this chief resilience officer as one of the key features. It works maybe some places, but I've also seen places where it doesn't work.
Sure. We've got a few more minutes before we wrap up, and I wanted to finish on some of the sessions. When we have time, we will have questions, but we were a little bit late starting, so I'm going to finish off with one kind of quite broad question, and it's around risk, in a way. 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, Naomi Stead gave a presentation at the Landscape Architects Festival, and it was about eschatology, which is the study of the end of times. It was a very interesting way of looking at the climate change scenario, because what she said was, hundreds of years ago, the church wants to normalize behavior, wants to make people do what they want them to do. What they did was give them a projection that was disastrous, catastrophic. If you do wrong, you are going to burn in hell forever. Her proposition, or her provocation, was, we tend to actually dial back what might happen. Scientists certainly do. Scientists who are looking at climate projections think, crikey, well, that would be quite, maybe inflame things, let's dial it back a little. Do you think maybe we're being a little bit actually soft pedaling, you might say, in terms of where this might go? We tend to say if the range is between 1 meter and 2 meter in sea level rise, let's stick with 1 because that means we won't get howled down. But actually they're thinking it could be 2. Do you think maybe we need, because when Toby, you mentioned early on, I thought it was very interesting, we don't want to scare people. There's a motivating people in other ways. Join us, we've got this opportunity. I'm just being provocative here and say, do we actually need to scare people a bit?
So, have you ever done a thing at a dinner party where you say, if someone says, you know, if we only had half an hour left to live, what would you do? I don't think anybody said, oh, I'd think about policy and I'd do whatever. I think it's always been, I'd break open the drinks cabinet, whatever. And so I think there is I think there's a challenge there. I think there's also a human psychology thing, which fundamentally aligns with that. But again, the more that I often talk about my not ongoing, arguments with my brother as a child. And I think this has been a big challenge in the climate change space in particular. So the argument that my brother and I had repeatedly about any number of different things, but always the same argument, was, you don't understand me. No, I do understand you, I don't agree. Well, you can't understand me, because if you understood me, you'd have to agree. And that's basically how the whole sort of thing has blown out. I think the final thing I'd say on this, I'm rather taken with a phrase by the environmental activist Paul Gilding, who likens the work that we're doing on climate change preparation now, or preparedness. He says, it's really good stuff. He said, but if you think about climate change as an existential threat in the same way that the Allied forces in Europe faced the Nazi threat in World War II, it's the equivalent of the British Home Forces doing press-ups on the beach. Really good stuff. Probably better that you do it than not, but at the end of the day, it's not going to win any wars.
Lykke, do you agree? Or?
Well, definitely. I don't believe in scaring. I don't think it does any positive thing to our thinking. I think we have to be serious. We have to acknowledge. And I think it's right that, yes, we are also in Copenhagen looking at as like a 1 meter sea level rise in our planning. But the idea is that if you do it the right way, you can also say we can make a flexible planning, which can actually allow us to expand. I mean, we don't know what's happening. I mean, it's all. I normally say to people, it's like we are building a bridge to Sweden, only that Sweden is moving a little bit every day. And I think that's what we are also working towards. So you have to have sort of a dynamic planning. You have to be able to embrace that. But if you if you do all the real climate skepticism, I've been reading books and so on, which, it's like apocalypse, and you just give up and you sit there and say, well, there's nothing we can do. There's no way we can change anything. And in that way, we might as well break open the drinks cabinet right away.
Okay. Well, that's on that note of breaking out the coffee cabinet. That's really good. Thank you very much. We are going to take a short coffee break, and we're going to be back for Nigel Bertram, who's starting at 11:20. We are going to start on time at 11:20. So go and have a coffee and come back. But before you do, please join me in thanking Lykke and Toby. Thank you.